At my brother's engagement party, I sat at the far end of the table, completely ignored like I didn't exist. No one asked what I'd been up to, not even my mother. But when his fiancée pointed at me and said, "Wait, are you Claire Matthews, the author?" The entire room froze. This is the story of how I went from invisible daughter to the name on everyone's lips and what it truly cost me to get there. The chandelier above the dining table sparkled like 1,000 stars, refracting off the crystal glasses and polished silverware. Around the long oak table, laughter bounced off the walls, light and easy, the kind that comes when people are proud and satisfied with the way life has unfolded for them. I sat at the far end, my champagne flute untouched. "This roast, Judith, you've outdone yourself," a woman in pastel pink crooned. Mother smiled, her hand resting delicately near Ethan's arm. "It's an old family recipe, only for special occasions." The occasion, of course, was my brother's engagement dinner. Ethan, the future partner at some big firm in Chicago. Ethan, the golden son with the golden fiancé and the golden life. I watched as he passed a dish to Isabel with one hand and gently tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear with the other. Mother beamed, her pride barely contained. Father chuckled at some anecdote Ethan was sharing. No one asked what I'd been up to, and that wasn't unusual. I'd been home for almost an hour. I'd hugged my parents, smiled at the guests I vaguely remembered from childhood, and found my place at the table. But no one, not once, had turned to ask what I did now or how I was. I might as well have been one of the caterers. It wasn't new. Not by a long shot. Growing up in Westlake, Ohio, in a neighborhood where every lawn looked manicured by a professional and every mailbox bore a doctor or lawyer's name, I learned early what my place was. My mother, Judith, ran our home like a well-oiled machine. She kept a wall calendar filled with Ethan's soccer tournaments, debate, meets, and music recitals. My name was rarely there. My victories, few as they were deemed to be, never made it to that wall. Dad Robert was gentle, kind even. But he was the kind of man who chose quiet over conflict. He admired my mother's orderliness and respected her judgment in nearly everything. So when she dismissed my interests as frivolous, he said nothing. Ethan was the sun around which the Matthews universe revolved. He had charm, ambition, and the sort of effortless confidence that made adults adore him. Teachers would nod approvingly at his school reports during parent-teacher conferences, and church friends would marvel at how well-behaved and articulate he was. "That boy's going places," they said, and everyone believed it. Then there was me, Claire, the quiet one, the bookworm, the girl who preferred stories to soccer and who'd rather write in her diary than go to the mall. I remember the day I won the state writing contest in 8th grade. I'd written a short story about a girl who could speak to ghosts, using them as metaphors for the people we ignore in our daily lives. My English teacher called it hauntingly mature. I came home, clutching my certificate, practically glowing. Mother looked at it, nodded once, and said, "That's nice, but maybe next time try writing about something more practical. You know real life." I kept the certificate in a box under my bed. Never mentioned it again. That wasn't the only time. There was the summer Ethan broke his collarbone at camp. Mother cleared her schedule for weeks, managing every appointment and therapy session, rallying neighborhood support. That same summer, I got my first short story published in a local magazine. She never read it. As a child, you don't know what you're missing. You just feel the quiet, the absence, the way your words fall into voids while someone else's are caught and treasured. You begin to speak less, dream smaller, until one day the silence becomes normal. And here I was, decades later, sitting at a table full of laughter, still invisible. It wasn't about jealousy. I loved Ethan in a way, or at least I used to before the years and the imbalance wore away whatever sibling closeness we might have had. It was about something deeper, a sense that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. That I could write a best-selling novel, win awards, be interviewed on national television, and they'd still remember the year Ethan made varsity over anything I'd accomplished. As the guests toasted to love and futures, I glanced at my hands, tracing the edge of my plate with one finger. The sounds around me blurred wine glasses, clinking forks, scraping Ethan's booming laughter. A part of me had always known this night would come. Another part had hoped absurdly that maybe this time would be different, that someone would turn to me and say, "Claire, what have you been working on lately?" But no one did. And in that silence, louder than the dinner's merriment, the past came roaring back, not in angry shouts, but in all the words never said. The bus station smelled like stale coffee and damp upholstery, but to me it was the scent of freedom. I remember the moment vividly, my duffel bag at my feet, my acceptance letter to Columbia University folded neatly in my pocket, and the knowledge that no one from my family would be there to see me off. No hug from Mom, no last-minute advice from Dad, not even a "we're proud of you." Just a half-hearted reminder the night before from my mother, "New York is loud and dangerous. Don't get too idealistic." I didn't reply. I knew she wasn't asking for my opinion. She never really did. So I boarded the bus with more silence than luggage, but for the first time in my life, I felt light. There were no eyes measuring me against Ethan. No one to remind me how impractical my dreams were. As the bus rolled out of Westlake, I stared at the fading rows of identical mailboxes and manicured lawns and felt something like air filling my lungs. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was just the room to finally breathe. New York was everything they warned me about and more. It was brutal, loud, relentless. But it was mine. I rented a shoebox of an apartment in Washington Heights with a roommate named Jade, who was obsessed with crystals and made a living reading tarot cards. The walls were thin, the heat temperamental, and the subway rats looked like they could file taxes, but I didn't care. I worked morning shifts at a coffee shop called Bean Line, scrubbing milk pitchers and burning my fingers on espresso machines. By night, I took literature seminars and scribbled short stories on napkins during my breaks. Most days, I was exhausted. I barely made rent. I recycled ramen flavors like a culinary roulette, and I once cried in the back storage closet when my manuscript got rejected for the 5th time in a row. But for all the chaos and caffeine-induced anxiety, there was something else brewing beneath the fatigue. Something alive, because for the first time, my voice mattered. In creative writing classes, people listened. My professors underlined my metaphors instead of ignoring them. Strangers emailed me thoughtful feedback on my blog. Even the regulars at Beanline, like the elderly man who tipped in poetry quotes, would ask what I was working on that week. I was still invisible to my own family, but in New York, I was starting to exist. Everything changed the day Eleanor Grant walked into Beanline. I didn't know who she was at first. She wore oversized tortoiseshell glasses, carried a notebook with her initials embossed in gold, and ordered black coffee with a splash of oat milk and a dash of cinnamon, no sugar, never sugar. She came in every Thursday at 3:15 p.m., always alone, always reading. One day, I saw her pull out an advanced copy of The Paris Letters, a novel that had recently swept the literary awards. I couldn't help myself. I told her I admired the author's character work, especially the way she wrote grief like it had a heartbeat. She looked up, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "Are you a writer?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Trying to be." "Good," she said. "Real writers always are." 2 weeks later, I handed her the first 10 pages of Paper Skies, my manuscript about a woman growing up in the shadow of her brother's achievements. I expected her to be polite. Instead, she emailed me 3 pages of notes, detailed, incisive, challenging. She asked questions my professors hadn't thought to ask. She poked at the soft parts of the story and encouraged me to dig deeper. Eleanor Grant, senior editor at Carrington Books, saw me in a way no one ever had, not just as a girl who could write, but as a woman who had something to say. It took a year to finish Paper Skies. I rewrote it 4 times. I cried during the 2nd draft and nearly quit during the 3rd. But Eleanor believed in it, and somehow that helped me believe in myself. When the book launched, it didn't become a viral sensation overnight. It grew slowly, word-of-mouth reviews, book club whispers. But then the New York Times reviewed it. Then Oprah's reading list picked it up. And one day I walked into a bookstore in Soho and saw it sitting on a display labeled Debut Voices to Watch. I stood there staring at the spine. Claire Matthews. My name, not as Ethan's sister, not as Judith's daughter, just me. I didn't tell my family. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because after all those years of writing in silence, I realized I no longer needed their applause. Their approval would have been counterfeit anyway. Polite nods, performative claps, maybe a phone call from Mom saying, "Well, that's nice, but you know writing isn't stable." No. I had built this life without them, word by word, rejection by rejection, and it was mine. There's a strange freedom in letting go of the people you once wanted so badly to notice you. I still thought about home sometimes. Westlake, the beige curtains, the predictable dinners. But now those memories felt like museum exhibits. Places I had visited survived and moved past. I was no longer the girl clinging to the edge of a family photograph hoping to be centered. I was the author of my own frame. It was autumn the last time I visited home. The leaves in Westlake had turned that rich, impossible red fiery and soft at once, and the familiar crunch beneath my boots made me feel for a fleeting second like maybe I belonged. Mom met me at the front door, wiping her hands on a towel. She looked the same hair in a tight bun, pressed slacks, lipstick one shade too pale. She gave me a quick hug, brief and stiff like someone greeting a neighbor, not a daughter she hadn't seen in nearly 3 years. "Well," she said, stepping back, "you look thin. Are you eating?" I smiled, the kind of smile you practice in mirrors. "Nice to see you too, Mom." Dad was in the living room reading the newspaper like he always did, though now it was on an iPad, which felt like a betrayal of sorts. He looked up, squinted, and stood. "Claire," he said, offering a handshake before pulling me into an awkward one-armed hug. "Still up in New York, huh?" "Yep," I said. "Still writing." That's when Mom cut in, already heading toward the kitchen. "Do you make enough to live on?" It wasn't even sarcastic. It was just inquisitive, as if I were an intern who needed financial coaching, as if she hadn't seen the features in national newspapers or noticed that I'd sent signed copies of both my novels unopened last time I checked on the hallway bookshelf. "I do all right," I said. "Rent's high, but I manage." She nodded. "Well, you know that city'll chew you up. You ever think about moving back?" To what I wanted to ask, but instead I just shrugged and followed her into the kitchen. Dinner was a lukewarm version of childhood meatloaf, peas, mashed potatoes from a box, the smell of lemon-scented floor cleaner. Ethan arrived late as usual, breezing through the door with an oversized duffel and a booming voice. "Hey, hey, look who's here." He kissed Mom on the cheek, high-fived Dad, and plopped into the seat across from mine. "Claire," he said, grinning, "still writing your little blog." It was a joke, I think. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe he genuinely thought that's what I did. I stared at him for a second, tried to laugh, then focused on my fork. Actually, Mom said Claire published another book recently. "Oh, yeah?" Ethan asked, mouthful of peas. "Anyone we know read it." My hands clenched under the table. "It was shortlisted for the Penn Hemingway," I said, voice even. He nodded, unimpressed. "Cool, cool. That's a publishing thing, right?" I excused myself early, claiming I had edits due. I left my untouched slice of pie on the table. That night, lying in the guest room that used to be mine, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the house breathe. Every creak of floorboard felt like a memory, dragging itself through time. The posters were gone, the desk replaced with a treadmill. The book I'd once hidden under my mattress, filled with teenage poems, and rage, was probably in a landfill by now. In that room, I realized something that changed me forever. I didn't need their recognition. I didn't need my mother to understand metaphor, or my father to quote my prose. I didn't need Ethan to know the names of the awards I'd been nominated for. I had built a life brick by bruised brick without any of their scaffolding. But what stung, what always stung, was not the lack of applause. It was that they still didn't see me. Not even now. I could walk into that house with a Pulitzer and they'd still ask if I planned to get a real job. That wasn't something I could fix. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to try. I left the next morning without saying goodbye. I wrote a note on the counter. "Thanks for dinner. Headed back early, tight deadline. Love, Claire." No one called, no one texted. Days passed, then weeks. At one point, I got a holiday card with a picture of Ethan and his girlfriend skiing in Aspen. Mom wrote, "Hope you're keeping warm in New York. Your brother's trip was a blast." Nothing about the visit, nothing about the book. I pinned the card to my fridge with a magnet shaped like a typewriter. It stayed there all winter untouched. There's a certain clarity that comes when you stop chasing people who aren't looking for you. I used to think I had to prove something to write well enough, achieve enough, become visible enough that they'd finally turn their heads and say, "That's our Claire." She made it. But that moment never came, and I stopped needing it to. Because here's the truth, no one tells daughters like me. Sometimes the family that forgets you is the one you have to leave behind to remember who you are. The invitation arrived on heavy cream cardstock, the kind you associate with trust funds and designer wedding planners. Gold lettering, delicate swirls, formal phrasing. You are cordially invited to celebrate the engagement of Ethan Robert Matthews and Isabel Grace Langford. I read it twice then, once more. My name wasn't even handwritten, just printed like an afterthought. For 2 weeks I left it propped on my bookshelf. I wasn't sure why. Maybe out of spite, maybe curiosity. Or maybe somewhere beneath the layers of distance and bitterness, I still wanted to be part of something I'd never truly belonged to. I RSVP'd on the last possible day. The engagement party was held at the Langfords' estate, because of course it was. The place looked like something out of a Nancy Meyers film, marble floors, golden chandeliers, and a backyard big enough to host a charity gala. I wore a navy blue dress and low heels, minimal makeup. A copy of my newest novel sat in the passenger seat of my rental car, unsigned. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it again, that old itchy feeling of not quite fitting. Conversations floated around me like soap bubbles I wasn't invited to touch. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone was someone, except me. Isabel was stunning, blonde in the way old Hollywood used to be. She moved like she'd rehearsed the role of fiancée her entire life. And to her credit, she greeted me warmly. "Claire Wright," she said, offering both hands. "I'm so glad you could come. Ethan talks about you all the time." That was news to me. Before I could respond, she added, "Claire Matthews." "You're the Claire Matthews?" I blinked. "Depends on who you ask." She laughed, a soft, melodic sound that felt practiced but kind. "No, I mean Claire Matthews, the author, the one the New York Times called a quiet force in contemporary fiction." A hush seemed to ripple through the nearby guests. My mother, standing a few feet away with a glass of Chardonnay, turned her head. "I think you must be thinking of someone else," she said, smiling tightly. "Just a coincidence." Isabel furrowed her brow. "No, I'm sure. I just finished Paper Skies. I cried during the chapter with the attic. That metaphor about silence devastating. My heart knocked against my ribs. I looked at Mom, looked at Ethan, looked at Isabel, bright-eyed and sincere, and I smiled. "No," I said gently. "It's not a coincidence. That's me." There was a pause, brief but seismic. You could hear it in the silence that followed. The shifting of weight, the raised eyebrows, the flickers of realization. Ethan looked confused. "Wait, but I'm a writer," I said, still smiling. "Published a few books. Isabel happened to read one. You never mentioned that," he said, as if I'd failed to tell him I was married with children. "I did," I replied. "Years ago, over dinner. You said something about blogs and laughed." He turned a shade redder. "Well, I didn't know you were like a real author." There it was. Mom still hadn't said anything. Her grip on her glass had tightened. Dad was standing by the cocktail shrimp, pretending to examine a decorative lantern. Isabel, bless her, broke the tension. "You're incredible," she said. "I dog-eared half your book." It felt like someone finally put words to things I've never been able to explain. Her voice cracked slightly, like maybe the story had touched something buried. Something real. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. She pulled me aside a moment later, away from the crowd. "Your book made me call my sister," she whispered. We hadn't spoken in years. I read a scene out loud to her. She cried. I didn't know what to say, so I hugged her. For the rest of the evening, a few guests asked quiet questions. Someone mentioned seeing my name on a list of literary award finalists. Another asked for a recommendation. My mother stood nearby watching, listening, her lips set in a line I couldn't decipher. Later, when the music had shifted to soft jazz and people had started slipping into goodbye hugs, I found myself standing by the dessert table next to Mom. "You should have told us," she said. "I did," I replied. She didn't look at me. Not like this. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Just tired. "You never asked." That night, back in my hotel room, I took the book from the rental car and opened to the dedication page. To the girls who were told to be quiet. May your silence one day echo. I ran my fingers over the ink. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. But not because my family had suddenly decided I was worthy. No, it was because someone who didn't owe me anything had recognized my voice. A stranger with kind eyes and a borrowed story had said the words I'd once begged my own mother to say. You matter. The applause had long since died down. Dessert plates were cleared, soft music floated through the backyard, as laughter softened into murmurs and small talk. And yet beneath the glow of string lights and the smell of garden roses, the tension clung to me like dew. My mother was still watching me, not with admiration, not even with irritation. It was something else, an unsettled, analytical sort of gaze, like she was trying to put together a puzzle she wasn't even sure she wanted to finish. Every now and then, she glanced at the guests who had overheard Isabel's exclamation, who now approached me quietly with nods and polite affirmations. "That was your book?" one man asked, shaking my hand. My wife sobbed through chapter 12. I smiled, offered thanks, made eye contact. But part of me was frozen, because my mother didn't say a word, not a nod of agreement, not a yes, she's ours. Just that same thin-lipped expression of calculation, as if claiming me too quickly might cost her something. Ethan hovered nearby with a glass of wine, looking somewhere between amused and overwhelmed. "Guess I need to read it now," he said, chuckling. "Only if you want to," I replied, my voice calm. He scratched the back of his neck. "It's just weird, you know. You're kind of famous, and we didn't even know." That we echoed louder than it should have. Later, after the party had thinned and the air had cooled, I slipped out to the garden. The Langfords' backyard was absurdly beautiful hedges, trimmed like sculpture, a small fountain bubbling at the center, wrought iron benches nestled under archways of vines. I found one near the back beside a patch of white lilies. I needed air, not just to breathe, but to exist without having to brace myself. I don't know how long I sat there, legs crossed, hands folded in my lap. The moon hung low, casting soft shadows across the grass. I heard the crunch of shoes on gravel, the familiar weight of footsteps. "Mind if I join you?" My father's voice. I nodded without turning. He sat beside me, slow and quiet, like someone sitting with a patient in recovery. For a while we just sat. No words, no expectations. Then softly, "Your mother's rattled." I gave a small laugh. I noticed. She didn't expect all that. I tilted my head, still looking forward. "All what?" He paused. "People knowing your name. Saying those things. Compliments." "Recognition," he said more softly. "It's not that she's not proud. I think she just didn't know how much she didn't know." I finally turned to look at him. "And you." He offered a weak smile. "I'm still catching up." Another silence fell, but this one felt warmer. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "I jotted down the names of your books," he said, a little embarrassed. I want to start reading them." My throat tightened. He glanced at the paper, avoiding my eyes. "Which one should I start with?" There it was. Not an apology, not a sweeping declaration, but something better, a change in behavior. When you grow up being overlooked, you learn to survive on breadcrumbs. A nod here, a quick glance there, a half-hearted comment you cling to like gospel. You learn to read tone, not words, behavior, not declarations. And that night, in the quiet of the garden, with a father who had rarely looked past his newspaper, I felt something shift. He wanted to know me. Now maybe. Late, but not never. And that mattered. Back inside, the last of the guests were hugging goodbye. Isabel saw me through the window and stepped outside with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "I just wanted to say again," she said, eyes sincere. "Your book helped me reconnect with my sister. That's a big deal." "I'm so glad," I said. She hesitated. "Your mom, she didn't say much, but I hope you know you've got fans. You're seen." Her words struck a tender chord. Not because they healed something, but because they acknowledged something I'd carried for years. "Thank you," I whispered. "That means more than you know." Later in my hotel room, I thought about how strange it was, this sudden exposure in a place where I had spent most of my life unseen. My mother's silence, my brother's awkward jokes, my father's quiet question. They weren't milestones, but they were shifts, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes love doesn't arrive in applause or epiphanies. It arrives as a question. A paper slip. A bench in the garden under moonlight. Sometimes love is just someone finally asking, "Where should I begin?" The morning after the engagement party, the house felt quieter than usual, muted, like it too was holding its breath. I had come downstairs early, hoping to grab a cup of coffee and maybe slip out unnoticed, but my mother was already there. She stood at the kitchen counter, her back to me, stirring something in a mug. For a moment, I considered turning around and heading back up the stairs, but she turned before I could. "I thought you might leave early," she said without looking directly at me. "I thought about it," I replied. She nodded slowly. "Sit, please." I hesitated, then pulled out a chair. The kitchen still smelled like last night's flowers and sugar, and the silence between us hummed like static. "I didn't sleep well," she said finally. Kept thinking. I waited. She set her mug down and leaned on the counter. "I don't understand why you never told us. About the books, the awards, the articles, all of it." I blinked. "I did," I said gently. "Not all at once. But I told you once when the first book came out." You nodded and asked if it was self-published. Her face flushed. She looked away. And then I continued. I tried again. "When I got the New Yorker feature, you said something about how lucky I was to still be writing those little stories. You didn't ask for a copy. You didn't even ask the title." My voice didn't rise, but it thickened. "I stopped telling you because I realized you weren't listening." She took a breath, held it. "Then I wasn't trying to hurt you. I know. I guess I didn't think it was real, or maybe I didn't want it to be. That caught me off guard." I tilted my head. "Why?" She was quiet for a long time. Then so softly, I almost didn't hear it, because if it was real, if all that success was real, it meant you did it without us. She finally looked up, eyes glassy, and that made me feel obsolete. I didn't know what to say. For all the years I'd wanted a reckoning, for all the arguments rehearsed in mirrors, the letters never sent, I had never prepared for this. She sat down across from me, folding her hands together like she was trying to hold herself steady. "You were always different," she said. "Not in a bad way, just quieter. You kept things inside, and I was always chasing Ethan's whirlwind. He needed so much attention, you know." I nodded, but I didn't let her off the hook. "And I didn't." She closed her eyes. "You needed something else, and I didn't know how to give it." We sat there in silence, two women who had spent a lifetime orbiting each other without touching. Finally, she spoke again. "I was scared, Claire, scared that if I truly looked at who you were, this woman, this writer, I'd find someone I didn't understand, and you'd be too far away to ever reach again." Her voice cracked. "So I told myself it didn't matter, that writing wasn't real, that your world wasn't real, because then I didn't have to admit I'd missed it." She wiped at her face quickly, almost angrily. "I've been proud of Ethan for so long, but I didn't realize I could be proud of you too. I didn't know how." My throat tightened. She reached across the table, not for my hand, just far enough that the space between us felt smaller. "I can't fix what I missed," she said, "but I don't want to keep missing it. If you'll let me try." I looked at her for a long moment, and to my own surprise, I didn't feel resentment. What I felt was relief. Not because everything was okay, not because she had finally said the perfect thing, but because for once she had stopped pretending. She had dropped the mask, even just briefly, and shown me the woman behind it, the one who was scared and trying and real. "I don't need you to fix anything," I said. "I just want you to see me. Here. Now." She nodded. We didn't hug. We didn't cry in each other's arms. It wasn't that kind of moment, but it was enough, for now. That afternoon, she slipped a note into my travel bag. It wasn't long, just a scribbled message on the back of a grocery list. I started Paper Skies. I'm only 3 chapters in, but I already know I've never met this Claire before. I'd like to. It was underlined twice. The wedding was held on a crisp spring afternoon at a vineyard just outside Charlottesville. Rows of white chairs lined the grass, lavender-filled mason jars, dangling from shepherd's hooks. The whole scene looked like something out of a bridal magazine, perfect, curated, and expensive. I arrived early mostly to avoid being the last one seated and to get through the inevitable small talk. By now, most of Ethan's friends knew who I was, not just Ethan's sister, but that Claire Matthews, the author, the one who had turned quiet grief into language, the one who had once been forgotten in the margins of family dinners. Now people remembered. I had brought no date, no entourage, just a small leather-bound journal in my purse and the speech Ethan had asked me to prepare. That ask still lingered in my mind, surprising and surreal. Claire, he'd said over the phone weeks earlier, I'd be honored if you spoke at the wedding. I mean it. You're good with words, better than anyone I know. I almost asked if he'd read any of my books, but I didn't want to ruin the moment. Okay, I said simply. I'd be honored. The ceremony was brief and beautiful. Isabel looked radiant in lace, her smile soft but strong. Ethan cried during his vows, surprising everyone, including himself. The reception unfolded under a white canopy strung with golden lights. There was jazz clinking glasses, bursts of laughter, and the gentle thrum of reconciliation in the air. I sat at a table with my parents and a few family friends. Mom wore a light blue dress and a string of pearls I hadn't seen before. She looked rested, present. At one point during the meal, she leaned toward a woman beside her and said, "Claire's my daughter. She's a writer, you know, quite a successful one. It wasn't boastful. It wasn't obligatory. It was proud." The woman turned to me and smiled. "My daughter loves your work, especially the scene in Glass Birdcage, the one in the hallway. She said it made her feel seen." "Thank you," I said, voice steady. That scene came from a very real place. Across the table, Dad dabbed his mouth with a napkin and cleared his throat. "Would you mind?" he asked, "if I read something?" I blinked. Of course not. He pulled a folded page from his jacket pocket, an excerpt I realized from Paper Skies. He began to read. "Sometimes we don't vanish all at once. Sometimes we disappear in pieces, first our laughter, then our ideas, then our names in family stories. Until one day we are nothing more than the echo of a chair that was once filled." As he read, his voice cracked. He paused, inhaled, and continued. When he finished, there was a silence at the table. Not awkward, not uncomfortable. Reverent. He looked at me, eyes glossy. That one stayed with me, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father as more than a quiet observer. I saw him as a man who had finally found the words he'd never known how to say. Later that evening, after the toasts and the first dance, Ethan handed me the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "my sister Claire has something to share. She's spent a lifetime turning emotion into language. I figured she could give Isabel and me a few words to start ours." I stood heels firm against the wooden floor of the dance tent. Hundreds of eyes on me, yet I felt nothing but calm. "Thank you," I said into the mic. Not just to Ethan and Isabel, but to everyone here. Weddings are a kind of rebirth, aren't they? Not just for the couple, but for the family. They pull tighter around them. I paused, letting the air settle. When Ethan asked me to speak, I thought about all the things I could say about love, about trust, about timing. But what kept rising to the surface was the idea of recognition, of being truly seen. I glanced toward my parents' table. Sometimes we grow up in rooms full of people who know our birthdays and allergies and favorite colors, but still don't know us. And sometimes life brings us back to those rooms not for revenge, but for redemption. My voice didn't shake. It rang clear. To Ethan and Isabel, may your love be the kind that sees, the kind that notices quiet things, the kind that asks not just what's wrong, but what are you holding back? May you never stop learning the language of each other's hearts. A beat, a breath. And to the rest of us, may we never wait until weddings or funerals to say the important things. The applause was soft but sincere. I handed the mic back to Ethan, who pulled me into a hug. "Thank you," he whispered. "That was perfect." Outside, under the fairy lights, strung between oak trees, I walked alone for a while. The stars were out blinking gently against a navy sky. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt free. Free from the weight of invisibility. Free from the need to perform for people who finally saw me. Not because I demanded it, but because I no longer needed it to define me. And that somehow made all the difference. New York greeted me with its usual blend of chaos and comfort. Cabs honking, steam rising from manhole covers, pedestrians dodging one another with practiced precision. The city hadn't changed, and somehow that steadiness felt like an embrace. I returned to my apartment and unpacked slowly books, scarves, the note my mother had slipped into my travel bag. I placed it gently into a drawer, not to hide it, but to keep it. Like a bookmark in a chapter I never thought I'd finish. 3 mornings later, I found myself back at Beanline, the coffee shop where everything had started. It still smelled the same burnt espresso cinnamon paper cups. The barista had changed, but the rickety wooden chairs and chipped ceramic mugs were exactly as I remembered. I chose the corner seat by the window, pulled out my laptop, and opened a new document. Title, "The Daughter They Forgot." I stared at the blinking cursor, then began to type. The story flowed differently this time. I wasn't writing to be seen. I wasn't writing for revenge. I wasn't even writing to make sense of the past. I was writing from a place of stillness, a knowing that came not from validation, but from survival. The words came easily. Some chapters were rooted in memory, others imagined, but each one held a truth I had earned, that healing doesn't always come wrapped in reconciliation. Sometimes it comes when you realize you never needed the apology to begin with. The letters started arriving 2 weeks later. Real ones. Handwritten. From my mother, mostly short notes, sometimes accompanied by clippings from newspapers or recipes she thought I might like. There was a quiet in her tone that felt different now. Less performative. More curious. My father sent fewer notes, but more thoughtful ones. One simply said, "Finished glass birdcage. I think I finally understand what you meant about rooms within rooms. Thank you." They weren't grand gestures, but they were gestures. And for me, that was enough. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled like applause across the skyline, I wrote the final line of the manuscript. I didn't need them to know I existed to become who I am, but I am still grateful they finally saw me. I leaned back, let the sentence settle into silence, and closed the laptop. Not with a bang, with peace. That evening I walked along the Hudson, the breeze tugging at my coat. A couple passed me laughing. A cyclist whizzed by with earbuds and determination. The city pulsed around me, unconcerned with where I had been or who had forgotten me. I smiled. Because the truth is, sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is exist on her own terms. To become something, not despite being unseen, but in the silence of it. To build a self so whole, so quietly resilient that when others finally look up, they see someone they can no longer ignore. Back at home, I printed the manuscript 1 chapter at a time. I placed the pages in a folder and labeled it in black ink, "The Daughter They Forgot," and then in parentheses underneath, "But she remembered herself."